dear friends and fiends, to the sinister Sideshow. I'll be your host, Dr. Hemlock Bones, curator and collector of the strange, bizarre and macabre. We are about to unravel the dark and murky depths of the history of body snatchers, those most foul ghouls who pulled those at rest from the soil under the shroud of darkness. This will not be for the faint of heart, but if you choose to stick around, hold your lantern and don't stray from the path, for wicked men hide in the shadows of the night's veil. To start our journey, we must go to the place where all tales start, the very beginning. For a story that ends in a mire of cruel deeds, the source from which its eventual sea of blood springs is sparked by less ominous circumstance. It commences with the quest for knowledge and learning, with the hope of providing help to those in need. You see, the world's first recorded autopsy happened in 300 BCE in the Mediterranean city-state of Alexandria, when two physicians began the study of corpses in the hopes of learning and understanding about the origins of disease. These pioneers were the first of many doctors throughout the ancient Greece and ancient Roman Empire who spent their lives being schooled by the dead, finding answers to life's mysteries through the secrets hidden within the deceased. But when the church became the leading European power, these studies were banned. Years later, in the period of Renaissance, there were, of course, those who tried to step out from the overbearing shadow caused by the church, folk who quested for new knowledge and could see a way to have their need fulfilled. But, alas, the practice was shunned by society under this rule. As the years rolled by and medicine improved and became a career in its own right, moving away from the ideas of barber surgery, in which those in charge of medical procedures were largely seen as butchers, and colleges and medical schools began to take form, doctors once again were in need of bodies, in need of a way to teach their students properly. Unfortunately for said doctors, there was a shortage of this ever so sought after teaching aid. These schools told the higher-ups about their need for cadavers, and their pleas were answered with the not-so-generous offering of 1 executed criminal per year. Not enough to teach the growing number of pupils. The criminals sentenced to dissection by the courts were those guilty of capital crimes, murder, burglary, rape and arson. The dissection was seen as an extra punishment, one that may affect the fate of the soul of that guilty party. You see, the folk in those days thought that letting the physicians loose on their corpses would mangle their bodies for the judgment day, when the Lord would come and resurrect the departed. It would be prudent to note that although the society at large thought dissection to be a heinous act on those recently deceased, they were more than happy to indulge in the morbid revelry of eating mummies as medicine, and later unwrapping the mummies as a form of entertainment. A curious case of not in my boneyard, perhaps. So, with this lack of a legal supply of much-needed teaching tools, the doctors turned their attentions to a more devious and unsavory way of getting what they needed. Yes, they began to steal from the graveyards. In fact, at the school in Glasgow, many students were involved in the snatching of bodies for anatomy lessons to help pay their tuition fees. And over in Edinburgh, students were stealing so many corpses that in 1721, a clause outright prohibiting students from stealing cadavers was put in their indenture. Strange as it may seem, as far as the law was concerned, the act of stealing a body was only a misdemeanor rather than a felony, and therefore was only punishable by a fine or imprisonment. But it was illegal to dissect them. It was also illegal to take anything the corpse had with it. The body would be stripped bare of clothes, and jewellery would always be left behind. Eventually, those living below the breadline and criminals became attracted to the opportunity to make a decent wage by aiding the medical schools with their demand for corpses. This kept the doctors and students out of jail, and thus began the golden age of the trade in human flesh. These pirates of decaying treasures became known as resurrectionists, or more colloquially, the sack-em-up men, body snatchers, shoesy lifters, corpse lifters, noddies, and of course, burkers. A question those of you of a more crepuscular state of mind might be wondering what methods these dealers in death used to achieve the looting of such unpleasant commodities. So exactly how does one burgle a corpse? Well, luckily for you, dear viewer, your old pal Dr. Bones is no stranger to a darkened graveyard. It is true that I have upon occasion happened upon some activities that would frighten and chill the spine of those of a more delicate constitution. So let me illuminate how one might commit this deed most foul. Well, first things first, you need to find yourself a fresh corpse. Not that everyone is lucky enough to, of course. More than once greenhorn body snatchers found themselves face to face with a ripe corpse past its best, mistakenly having dug up the wrong site. There are even tales of sack-em-up men digging up a cadaver only to find it's one of their own relatives, or even once their spouse. And lest we forget the reason for many a death, disease. So one is putting themselves face to face with all manner of deadly and horrible diseases. Resurrection men who knew what they were doing would send out spies. Oftentimes women to attend funerals or do reconnaissance in cemeteries under the guise of grieving relatives. And now we get down to the mechanics. Now, there were many folks under the impression that these boneyard burglars were digging a hole as far as 20 feet away from the gravesite, then removing a small patch of turf and proceeding to dig a tunnel that took them all the way to the coffin, and then either drag that out with hooks or bust it open inside the tunnel, loop a rope around the corpse's feet or neck, or jam a rather large hook into their scalp, sounds painful, and drag out the prize. Well, if you think about that, it seems like rather a lot of effort, when you could just be careful instead. Those twilight fiends needed only to dig down at the head of the coffin, using their trademark wooden shovels, so as to lower the volume of their dastardly deeds and attract less attention. They would place the soil atop the freshly dug soil at the end of the grave and use a sack to catch the excess if they thought it would fall upon the grass and leave any evidence behind. Once down at the coffin, they used a crowbar or a coffin corkscrew to snap open the coffin lid, and then all that was needed was to slip a couple of specially made body hooks under the armpits of the cadaver, or sling a noose around its neck and drag it out. The hooks would tend to leave a few puncture marks in the skin, but no one seemed to complain. In one particular American body snatcher case, the hook would be hooked under the cadaver's chin. Then all you had to do was strip your body, as we said before, because you know stealing a body is a misdemeanor, but stealing someone's property was a far more grave crime in the eyes of the law, and could boost your punishment. Now, all you need to do, fold your body in half, or sometimes snap it, depending on how long they've been extinguished for, throw it a sack, and be on your merry way. Although, before you popped your festering booty into a bag, you'd want to give them a quick haircut, as their locks were worth a few bob from the wig makers, and then you'd want to open their trap and yank out any of their teeth, because those pearly whites were worth a pretty penny when body snatching was at its height, and since there was a chance you might get yourself caught by the night guard or even passers-by and have to ditch your body, at least all your hard work wouldn't be for naught. It seemed Georgian society had a penchant for full snatchers made from real human teeth, and would pay top dollar for them. Those in search of teeth would actually travel to battlefields to relieve the dead soldiers of their literal white gold. Now, apart from the hard labours of digging, wrenching out teeth, folding and hauling corpses, our resurrectionists had themselves other obstacles to contend with. People, especially those grieving the loss of a loved one, were, let's say, less than impressed with these nighttime raids, and steps were taken to keep those body hijackers at bay. An early method was to compact the soil down nice and hard, put some branches over the graveside, and cross your fingers that those pesky body bandits would think it's too much work to dig up. Although at the going rate, that wasn't too likely. So, if you were one of the upper class folk, your family might dig their hands deep in their pockets and fork out for a mordstone. Basically a gargantuan and heavy rock that would cover up your freshly interred corpse. Of course, as time progressed, things got more elaborate for those who could afford it, and more safes, above ground iron cages which would keep out thieves until the body putrefied and wasn't worth anything, became the next stage in the ever elaborate deterrence against the sack-a-mud crews. In addition, there were mort houses, special buildings where you could pay a weekly fee for the recently expired to wait until decomposition had set in and they were useless to those pesky body snatchers. Those without the money to spend on protecting their dead tried their best to protect their deceased by strategically piling small piles of stick, stones or shells over the fresh grave to help them spot any foul play. All manner of inventions sprung up to avoid friends and relatives' cadavers ending up on the anatomist's slab. Coffin collars were popular. A simple device was fixed around the throat and bolted into the base of the casket. You could even buy tamper-proof iron coffins. In the US, a coffin with a small window over the deceased's face was designed so relatives could check the body was still inside. As the amount of resurrectionists swelled in answer to the growing demand for fresh bodies, folk began to organise, and groups with guns started to guard the cemeteries, set up booby traps and build watchtowers. But try as they might, those fiendish ghouls were still making their way off with their lifeless trophies. So as one such ghoul, once you've cleared the graveyard, you have yourself a whole other issue on your soil-stained hands. Just exactly how does one go about transporting a body through a busy city to a doctor located elsewhere? Well, sometimes a plan would be as simple as throwing your decaying spoils into a sack or perhaps a tea chest and carrying it through town. But sometimes folk had to get a little more inventive. There were times when these morbid muggers would take their corpse, dress it in new clothes and finery, perhaps a spritz of perfume, depending on how ripe they were at the point of being removed from their resting place, sling an arm over your shoulder, and walk them through town, excusing their drunken state as you wave at unsuspecting passers-by. Or, in the case of some of the medical students in Glasgow, pop them between a couple of students riding in a carriage and pass them off as an ill classmate. If the night watchman had noticed you and given chase, you might need to hide the body en route, with the hopes of picking it up at a later date. Plenty of stolen bodies were thrown into bushes and hedges and stuff. Very respectful. In one such case in Aberdeenshire, a group of students, after stealing a body, got scared, decided to rebury the corpse in the sands of a local beach and come pick it up once the search party was gone. Unfortunately for them, the sea had other plans. The water wore away the sand and her body washed out the ocean. Eventually, she washed back into the bay 2 months after the time of her original burial. Perhaps it was the Canadians, though, who managed to figure out the most creative way to make it clear at the churchyard. The medical students were stealing bodies in the cold winters of Montreal. They would climb to the peak of Mount Royal, steal a corpse, and use it as a toboggan to carry them down to the base of the hill. Occasionally, there would be an accident, and they would lose control of their human sleigh, leaving it to tumble into a street full of onlookers. Not to be perturbed, the students would then try and convince the public that it was just an unfortunate yet fatal sledding accident, which had somewhat suspiciously left a completely naked body slumped in the middle of the street. Bodies would also be transported to where they would fetch the most coin. often sent from Ireland to Scotland via steamboat, hidden in crates under labels that the thieves prayed would help hide the true manner of the cargo. In America, the railroads were used, bodies being folded into whiskey barrels, topped with the brown liquor itself to disguise the smell of rot. But perhaps the most disturbing fact was that the whiskey that had accompanied the corpse on its journey was never wasted. No, the foul spirit would be in fact sold to the public as stiff drinks. Delightful. Over the years, the resurrectionists became more organised and gangs began to form. There were well-known groups in London, Edinburgh, Belfast, Dublin, and far beyond. Of course, in each city where the gangs had formed, there were rivalries. Sometimes the members of these gangs were in a quarrel with another group working in the same cemeteries, and they would deliberately desecrate the graveyard, stand open coffins against the churchyard walls, and leaving open graves. This would bring about public outrage and stop anyone from operating in that specific place for a while, hopefully putting the other gang out of business. These gangs would even go so far as to organise themselves against the surgeons to raise the price per body. Once there was even a strike organised by the sack-em-up men in order to raise the price paid for each cadaver by 2 guineas. When surgeons tried to avoid the price hike by going to freelance grave robbers, one such gang broke into the medical school, threatened the students, and mutilated the corpses bought from the freelancers. The surgeons called the police, but to avoid their own detection and continue their anatomical research, they were forced to bail out the gang members and reopen negotiations. There's even a case in the States where a well-known body snatcher who had some disagreement with medical students and so exacted his revenge by purposefully supplying them with a body riddled with smallpox. You didn't mess around with these folk. Both of the anatomists and the resurrectionists were subject to attacks by mobs. Properties and schools engaged in dissections were damaged and destroyed. Sometimes doctors were even mauled by rioters. Involvement in the business of body snatching was a dangerous game to play. The rich and famous were not exempt from the scope of the body snatchers. In one infamous case, a gang of Chicago body snatchers had set their sights on stealing the corpse of none other than Abraham Lincoln. This band of reprobates planned more than just stealing the body for anatomical research, though. They planned a kidnapping. The idea was to steal the presidential cadaver and then demand a ransom of $200,000 for its safe return. Unfortunately for them, their plan was foiled by an undercover agent posing as a sack-em-up man. You may believe that these terrible tales are dark enough to warrant my attentions, but horrifying as it may be, these tales only get darker and more grisly. You see, some folks didn't really fancy the hard work that came along with digging up corpses, and those folk came up with a much more sinister way of collecting and selling corpses. They turned to murder, killing for cash, a crime most heinous. Two of the most infamous of these cold-blooded cutthroats were Burke and Hare, two fellows who emigrated to Edinburgh from Ireland to build the Union Canal, and upon its completion, they found themselves looking for a new way to make some dough, and the answer to their problems fell into their laps. Mr. Hare owned a lodging house, and one of his lodgers, an older man, happened to die of dropsy, horrible disease, whilst owing him rent. Well, Mr. Hare was not best pleased with this turn of events, as you might imagine. The pair had heard tell of the money to be made by selling corpses to the medical school, so they packed the old man into a wooden box and walked him up to the medical school in search of a buyer. There they were found by a student who gave them directions to Surgeon Square, where they would make a deal for the cadaver with the assistant of an unscrupulous doctor known as Dr. Robert Knox. He paid them the princely sum of £7 10 shillings for the body. The doctor was pleased with the freshness of the body, and they were told if they happened across another body, the anatomist would gladly take it off their hands. Well, not too long later, another lodger staying with Hare became ill with a fever. As the story goes, Hare and his wife became concerned that having a potentially contagious lodger might be bad for their business, and so the decision was made to ply the man with whiskey, suffocate him, and sell his body for a pretty penny. Their plan paid off, and Knox paid them £10 for their troubles. Their murder technique was ingenious. Whilst Hare would cover the nose and the mouth of the victim, Burke would lay across the chest and restrict their movement. This method was led not only to a practically undetectable cause of death at the time, but also kept the bodies in near perfect state, which pleased the anatomists greatly. There were rumours that the pair were taught this method by Knox himself, or at least someone with medical knowledge. This technique became known as Burking. Well now, spurred on by the high wage, the pair embarked on a murder spree, killing anywhere between 16 and 30 innocent victims. For a while, the pair seemed unstoppable on their spree, but then they began to come up stuck. They made the fateful mistake of murdering a local young man with learning difficulties, affectionately, if not politically correctly, known as Daft Jamie. Jamie was somewhat of a local celebrity who lived on the streets and made his living by helping local market storeholders and begging. He was instantly recognisable as he was extremely tall and suffered from a deformed foot. Jamie, unlike most of the pair's poor victims, was not drunk when Hare lured him back to his lodgings and sent his wife to bring Burke to help him, and as such, he fought back. But sadly, the killers finally managed to overpower him. When his body turned up at the medical school, many of the students recognised him instantly, but Dr. Knox denied it was the man they thought it was and removed Jamie's feet and dissected his face to avoid him being recognised should anyone call the police. Rumours of Jamie's disappearance began to circulate. The next murder was the final one committed by the pair. The public was on high alert. They killed a woman and stuffed her body under a bed in Hare's lodging house. Here she was discovered by two of his other lodgers who went straight to the police. Unfortunately, when the police turned up, the murderers had already taken the body to the medical school. However, police did find blood-stained clothing and the next day searched the medical school and found the poor victim's corpse. The pair were arrested and their trial for this final murder began on Christmas Eve and continued throughout Christmas Day. I think that we can say with confidence those present would rather have not been staring into the face of two murderers when they should have been having their Christmas dinner. Hare, the slippery, horrible, slimy character that he was, turned king's witness and blamed everything that had happened on his friend Burke and saved his own hide. Burke was found guilty of the murder. He was sentenced to execution, but the judge had a more fitting punishment in addition to the death sentence. The judge ruled that his body, once pronounced dead at the gallows, would be pulled down and sent to the medical school, where he would be publicly dissected and his skeleton would be removed, placed on display, lest anyone forget the atrocious crimes that he committed against the human race. You can still see this horrific reminder of the Westport murders today as it remains on display in Edinburgh. His skin was also removed and turned into souvenirs. Before his death, Burke confessed to a priest and laid far more of the blame at Hare's feet than at his trial. Hare did not completely escape retribution for his crimes. It is said that he was hunted down by an angry mob, thrown in a lime pit and blinded, dying a penniless beggar. Dr. Knox, of course, being of a higher societal standing, was cleared of all guilt by a jury of his peers, although there is no doubt that he knew these unfortunate victims had died in unnatural circumstances. Burke's the butcher, Hare's the thief, Knox the man who buys the beef. The crimes of this murderous pair horrified most people, but of course there were other opportunists with dark hearts who instead of repulsion saw these evil men as naught but inspirational. These men became known as the London Burkers. Once plain and simple resurrectionists, they moved on to copycat the crimes of the despicable Westport murderers. They operated in a similar manner, drugging rum with laudanum, tying the feet of their victims and drowning them upside down in a well. But it was not just men out murdering for cash. There were also women committing these dastardly acts. Elizabeth Ross was found guilty of murdering her friend, although she was suspected of other murders and was sent to the gallows for her crime, receiving the same after-death punishment as Burke in being dissected. And it was women who were out almost a century before Burke and Hare in the same neck of the woods as their male counterparts. Those women were Waldie and Torrance. This murderous duo are thought to be the first people ever to be executed for the killing for anatomical purposes. Waldie was a sick nurse, so in prime position to supply the surgeon with fresh cadavers. Who knows how many times she had done this, but the murder the two were found guilty of was that of a young lad. Waldy had promised the body of a young and gravely ill patient of hers to a surgeon's assistant, but the child's mother, who seemingly had been a part of this plan, pulled out. Now Waldy needed another victim, so, along with her neighbour Torrance, she decided to kidnap another ill child they knew of. They stole the young lad while his parents were out, plied him with ale, and suffocated the poor child. Torrance then wrapped him in her apron and took him to the anatomists. The anatomists, of course, suspected no wrongdoing, and so they paid for the body and spent the next couple of days dissecting parts of his stomach. Then they heard the rumours circulating town that the child had been murdered. They panicked, sewed up their handiwork, and dumped the poor lad's corpse in an alley. The body was discovered the next day, and after questioning neighbours, the police arrested the two women, and they were found guilty and sentenced to death. Torrance tried to delay her own hanging by pleading the belly, but it did not work, and both women were executed at Edinburgh's Grass Market in 1752. So there you have it, a frightening peer into the dark, grisly underbelly of the body snatchers, an illumination of the shadowy world filled with frightening folk you'd rather not meet, a history of fiendish deeds brought to light for a few mere minutes, and stories you wish you never heard. Thank you for letting me, Dr. Hemlock Bones, lead you on this terrifying journey. Sleep well tonight. Don't let the bedbugs bite. Until next time, dear friends.